Hi everyone, my name is Maria Polzin, and today we're going to be exploring alternative responses to violence. The type of violence we'll be focusing on is specifically intimate partner violence, much like your understanding of domestic violence, but it occurs between intimate partners and does not have to occur in the home. Let's start with a hypothetical. Jane and John Doe are a married couple with 2 children. Now in this hypothetical, we're going to be exploring male on female violence, as this is the most common form of intimate partner violence on record. However, that's not to undermine or silence plenty of narratives and the reality that violence does occur in non-heteronormative relationships. With that said, we have Jane and John Doe, and they've been having some marriage problems. It often manifests in emotional manipulation and verbal assault. However, the emotional manipulation has not been working to John's liking, and he's begun looking through Jane's text messages, technological abuse, and also begun taking control over her bank accounts, financial abuse. When this wasn't working, John began to physically abuse Jane, and Jane eventually called the police to de-escalate one of the heat of the moment situations. Upon calling the police, John was arrested as Jane had clear bruises and spent the night in jail. During this evening, Jane's community came over, and all of them, wanting to never see John again, convinced Jane to go through the court process of filing charges against John. Now, these court processes can take on average anywhere from 6 months to over 2 years in the United States. So we'll say about 2 years later, the case ends and John is convicted of domestic violence charges. He has a restraining order against him, must go to the traditional batterers intervention program, and he can only see his children once a month. John, a very loving father and desiring of his children, is very upset and begins stalking the home to try to see the kids. When Jane confronts him, the situation escalates to physical abuse and ends in homicide with a knife, as this is the most common form of domestic violence homicide. Now, I wish that this hypothetical was completely a figment of my imagination. However, unfortunately, this occurs all too frequently. According to the Department of Justice, every year, almost 900,000 non-fatal intimate partner violence victimizations occur. Of this, between 2005 and 2016, roughly 56% of the victimizations were reported to the police annually. Now, it's important to note that the Department of Justice uses a rather narrow understanding of intimate partner violence. It often begins with physical violence and ends with physical violence. Now, as we saw from the hypothetical, there are myriad forms of violences that occur in intimate partner situations, such as emotional, technological, financial. So taking these forms of violence into consideration, the National Center on the Prevention and Control of Injury found that more than 10 million victimizations occur annually. So if we couple that with the police reports, that means that roughly 20% of reports are actually being sent to the criminal legal system, and that leaves 80% of victims that feel the criminal legal system is not a viable support system in these situations. Furthermore, of the 20% that do engage with the criminal legal system, many, like Jane and John's situation, go on to end in homicide. Of the homicides that occur annually, many of those, the perpetrator had already had an encounter with the criminal legal system, whether that's through a restraining order, the batterers intervention program, or in instances, homicide. So we see both those engaging with the criminal legal system and those not engaging with the criminal legal system struggling to find viable options of support and means to end these cycles of violence. Today, I'm going to propose 3 frameworks of ways we can look at alternative responses to violence. That is vulnerability, language, and accountability, and we're going to explore these through the process of restorative justice. Now, Audre Lorde is going to ground my work today as she speaks on all of these topics, one being vulnerability. Of vulnerability, Audre Lorde says that when I look at the most vulnerable places of myself and I recognize the pain that I have felt, I can remove the pain from my enemy's arsenal. It's important to note that Audre Lorde is writing in the civil rights movement and after, alongside Black liberation theorists and activists like Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, and Assata Shakur. And so Audre Lorde's notion of vulnerability stems from a long tradition of radical love rooted in the Black liberation movement in America. So when we talk about vulnerability here, we're talking about how to transform our emotions to actually make space for liberation in a way that ends cycles of violence. This kind of vulnerability raises questions about our criminal legal systems and also makes space for new questions to be heard. In the criminal legal system, we ask, what laws have been broken? With restorative justice, we begin with the question, who has been harmed? And we recognize that there is more harm occurring than just the primary victim of abuse. In what ways was John harmed in his life that led to these cycles of violence? In what ways are the children being harmed? Perhaps the children are bringing this violence to school and disrupting their classrooms, and how can the teachers support them to mitigate this violence? With restorative justice, we create space for these questions. We then bring in the framework of language. Now, Audre Lorde says in her essay, Poetry is Not a Luxury, that on language, it is essential that we scrutinize not only the truth of what we speak, but the truth of the language by which we speak it. When we apply this to our responses to violence, we see that in the criminal legal system, the only voices that are valid are those spoken in legal terms. That is the lawyers, the jury, the judge, the legal representatives that take the narrative of the victim or of those who have caused harm and put them in a language that is palatable for the court. Now, we begin to see through this the process of actually removing autonomy from the victim themselves. So if we're asking how can the victim continue to be centered in this response to violence, we need to talk about whether or not we're using a language that is accessible. So with the criminal legal system, we ask the question, who did it? Who broke these laws? And with the restorative justice space, once we've created space for vulnerability and we begin to articulate those spaces of vulnerability, we can then ask, what are the needs of those that have been harmed? And that brings us to the third framework of accountability. In Audre Lorde's essay, The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action, Lorde writes that it is vitally necessary that each one of us recognize our function in the transformation, specifically of silence to language and action, and to recognize that this role is vital every step of the way. So when we apply this to the criminal legal system, we get the question, how can we meet the needs of those who have been hurt? Rather than how can we punish the perpetrator? So we begin to recognize that violence doesn't occur in a vacuum, especially intimate partner violence, which often occurs in the home. It incorporates the past and present of all individuals involved, of all individuals in the broader community, and even on a generational level. Did John grow up with violence in his home? How did his parents treat one another? And by asking these questions and asking how we can meet these needs, we can begin to see more holistic responses to violence. So let's return to our hypothetical. We can see now that perhaps this situation would have ended differently if Jane felt that during the emotional abuse or even the physical abuse, she had resources and systems and programs in her community that offered alternatives to mediate the violence in her home. We could also think about how would implementing these restorative approaches in our own lives perhaps prevent the emotional manipulation and verbal assault from ever occurring? How does the way that we treat each other on an interpersonal level in spaces like the classroom and our workplace and the streets manifest on a political scale? So I want you to begin asking these questions in your own life. Who has been hurt? What are the needs of those that have been hurt? And how can we meet those needs? When we ask each other these questions, we begin to do that emotional labor of vulnerability. We begin to hear ourselves articulate that and ask if we're articulating it in the right way. And we begin to call on our community and those that we express that to help hold ourselves accountable and to help one another hold themselves accountable. So I ask that you begin implementing these questions, and perhaps if you see restorative justice on a ballot or hear it referenced by a congressperson in the near future, which the likelihood is high, that you might consider supporting them now that you know what it is. Thank you.